Hello everyone, this is Iran Talk, and in this video I'd like to take a look at a new study that was published yesterday on the genetic origins of the Achaemenids, Parthians and Sassanians. This study featured new autosomal samples from northern Iran from the sites of Marsin Chal, Vestemin and Liarsanbon, but not only that, it also featured a couple of samples from the Chalcolithic from the Isfahan province. As you will see, these ancient Iranian samples contained very little European ancestry and were primarily of indigenous Iranian farmer descent, thus refuting the claims made by White Nationalists and Jason Reza Jorjani that the ancient Iranians were primarily of Nordic European stock. And this will be a very in-depth analysis, so I suggest that everyone stick to the end if you can. Now, without further ado, I'd like to begin the analysis. The study in question is titled Ancient DNA Indicates 3,000 Years of Genetic Continuity in the Northern Iranian Plateau from the Copper Age to the Sassanid Empire. The study is currently in preprint form, though I reckon that it will be published in a leading professional journal very soon. The study was conducted by a team led by Motahari Ala Amjadi, and this was primarily an Iranian team. For those of you who don't know, I previously made 2 videos on this study and I'm very glad that it's finally out, and I'm happy that the results that I presented in the original 2 videos have been corroborated here. In total, this study took a look at 50 samples from 9 archaeological sites across Iran, of which 23 are newly sequenced mitogenomes and 13 are nuclear genomes, and these date from 4700 BCE to 1300 CE. And the study also integrated previously available genetic samples, which is quite interesting. The study particularly focused on the Zagros region in Iran, and what's interesting is that these samples prove that there's been a great degree of genetic continuity, and overall these samples are the closest to South Central Asian Bronze Age populations, and particularly of importance here is the BMAC culture, and what this means is that these samples are very closely related to the original inhabitants of the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex. And below are the important abbreviations for the study. The key takeaway from the introduction of this study is that while the Iranian plateau has received influx of different ancestries from across West Asia as well as parts of South Asia and the Middle East and also the steppe, nonetheless, the overwhelming majority of the Iranian genome has been characterized by the Neolithic Iranian farmer ancestry, though nonetheless there are other ancestries, but these are present at very low frequencies. The study also highlights the point that the Caucasian hunter-gatherers are closely related to the Neolithic Iranian farmers. Moving on, it seems to be the case that the connections between Central Asia and West Asia were only further during the Achaemenid, Parthian and Sassanian periods. And the same can be said about the Seleucid period as well. In terms of the sites the samples were taken from, they're primarily from catacomb-type graves which were common or typical during the Parthian period as well as the Sassanian period, and that's quite interesting as well. And again, remember that these samples are from northern Iran, meaning that they're very close to the Caspian region. To illustrate this, here is a map of all sampled sites across Iran. This goes for the 5 sampled sites featured in this paper as well as all previous sampled sites. The 5 sampled sites for this paper are Gol Afshan Tepe from the Chalcolithic, Liarsanbon, Marsin Chal and Vestemin from the historic periods, and finally Kalmakareh cave from the medieval period. And there is also a legend at the bottom left there which depicts the different eras for these sites, and you can see it stretches from the Mesolithic to the medieval period. Now for the study there was an attempt to screen 50 samples, and of these 5 met the criteria for deeper shotgun sequencing. Despite this, there were a total of 13 new samples for which they could get admixture results for, and I will take a look at those later on in this analysis. And for those of you interested, here is the shotgun sequencing as well as the mitochondrial sequencing method. Here is the haplogroup information, and you can see that during the Chalcolithic, the samples belong to haplogroup R2A, but during the Achaemenid, Seleucid and Parthian periods, they belong to the haplogroups J2 and J1, which is very interesting. And to the right, you can also see information on the autosomal S&Ps analyzed as well as the sequencing and capture approach. It's also worth mentioning that in terms of their mitochondrial DNA, the haplogroups are primarily West Eurasian in origin, including T, J, K, and U, which is very interesting. And here is the rest of the chart, and you can see in terms of their paternal origins, haplogroup J1A2 as well as haplogroup J2A1 are predominant, and this is very interesting, and this shows that they have a largely Middle Eastern genetic paternal origin. And once again, the mitochondrial haplogroups are of West Eurasian origin. Unfortunately, there is no paternal information for the samples that were sequenced from later periods. Moving on, only one of the samples showed a high degree of inbreeding, and there were two others that had some inbreeding, but the remainder did not, and this means that Quedoda was likely not as widespread as previously believed to have been. For those of you who don't know, Quedoda was the pre-Islamic Iranian practice of next of kin marriage, and it has been alleged that many pre-Islamic Iranian shahs married their mothers, sisters, or daughters. But even if the practice was prevalent amongst the elite, these results prove that it was not really practiced by the general population. Here is the chart for mitochondrial haplogroup frequencies, and you can see that it ranges from the Neolithic to the medieval period, and for the most part nearly all of these lineages are West Eurasian lineages, meaning that Iranians primarily descend from a Caucasoid or Caucasian genetic pool on the maternal side. Moving on, here are the paternal haplogroups for the Iranian samples thus far sequenced from the Mesolithic to the historical period. As you can see, all are West Eurasian paternal lineages, with the most common being J2 as well as R1, and this is quite interesting. Though there were only two lineages for the samples featured in this study, and this is very interesting, and those were J1 and J2. And here is a PCA showing the clustering of these ancient lineages as well as the lineages of contemporary Iranians, and I'm referring to the maternal lineages. And here is just an explanation of the PCA, but the key takeaway is the fact that in the Liarsanbon province there's around 66% continuity between the Chalcolithic samples that were taken and the contemporary Liarstani population, and this just goes to show that the maternal gene pool of Iranians has largely remained stable. Here are the PCA results as well as the autosomal results for these samples, including the ones that were published in previous studies, and I will take a closer look at these now. Here are the autosomal results for all Iranian samples that have been thus far sequenced. As I have taken a look at the majority of these samples before, I will only focus on the ones that are from this study. I also wanted to add that this admixture panel contains samples that are from Iraq, from Turkmenistan, from Uzbekistan, as well as from Armenia and Georgia alongside the Iranian samples. Here is the legend for this autosomal analysis, and as you can see, each of the components are color-coded. The Balkan hunter-gatherer component is in light green, the ancient North Asian component is in magenta, the ancient North Eurasian component is in green, the Andamanese hunter-gatherer component is in blue, the China late Neolithic component is in pink, the Anatolian Neolithic farmer component is in brown, and finally in yellow is the Iran Ganj Dara Neolithic component. Here are the Neolithic samples that were sequenced in this study as well as the ones from previous studies, and you can see that the Gol Afshan Neolithic samples are very close to the Ganj Dara Neolithic samples, though nonetheless they do have a bit more Andamanese hunter-gatherer ancestry, which is comparable to both the Tepe Abdul Hussein Neolithic samples and the Wazma Neolithic samples. These results also prove that the Tepe Gol Afshan Neolithic samples are very close to previously sequenced Neolithic samples. Now here are the results for the samples from the Achaemenid and Seleucid periods, the Parthian period, as well as the late Parthian and mid-Sassanian periods. As you can see, they derive the majority of their ancestry from Iranian Neolithic farmers as well as Anatolian Neolithic farmers, and there is also a bit of ancestry from an Andamanese hunter-gatherer source and also ancestry from an ancient North Eurasian source with only minimal Balkan hunter-gatherer ancestry, and that's quite interesting. Thus, what these results prove is that on a genetic level, the ancient Iranians were not Nordic or Northern Europeans, but rather they were primarily an indigenous Iranian population with only minimal steppe input. And here's the principal component analysis for this study. And what's evident is that these ancient Iranian samples, which are highlighted here in yellow, cluster closest to Turkmenistan, Chalcolithic and Bronze Age samples, and these were the peoples of the BMAC culture. Thus, these results prove that the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanian Iranians were genetically closest to other Iranian farmer-derived populations, such as those of the BMAC culture. Here's a close-up version of this PCA, and you can see that the ancient Iranians are closest to the contemporary Iranians, as well as the Iranian Mazandaranis and the Iranian Bandaris. And what this means is that there is indeed a great degree of genetic continuity among today's Iranians. And what's more is that the ancient Iranians are also fairly close to the peoples of the BMAC culture, as previously mentioned. With these results in mind, a white nationalist who goes by the name of Nemitz or Peter Nimitz mentioned the Iranicist Michael Bonner and wrote, "There is noticeable shift in Iranian population makeup towards Mesopotamia, Levant, Arabia between Parthian and Ilkhan periods. Unfortunately, there aren't enough samples to see if due to Mesopotamian migration in Sassanid period as your book implies, or the Arabs." Nimitz also posted, "Near disappearance of Indian ancestry in Iran over course of Parthian, Sassanid and Abbasid periods is interesting, perhaps suggests a serious degree of population replacements from related groups, Mesopotamians washed in by empire, steppe Iranians blown in from steppe." Now both these posts are ridiculous and are just an attempt by white nationalists to show that population replacement ruined Iranian society, whereas this is not the case, as Iran continued to prosper even after the Arab invasion, and these genetic changes were overall minimal and, as you'll see, cannot be attributed to the Arab invasion or migration of Mesopotamians. Before I refute these two posts, here is yet another post, and this is from a white nationalist by the name of Lior Leffineder, and you can see that he says the Achaemenids ruled over the Indus, but by the time of the Parthians, the region was under a different empire, so this could be the same story as Eastern ancestry. In post-imperial Rome, migrants die out and local ancestry resurges. The first thing of importance to note here is that the samples featured in this study were from the very northern edge of Iran, near the Caspian region, and thus are not representative of all Iranians. Thus, these claims are absurd and do not make any sense in light of the available genetic evidence presented by the study. Now here is my refutation. As you can see, these are the samples that were previously sequenced, and in the case of the Haji Firuz Iron Age, the Hassanlu Iron Age, as well as the Dinka Tepe Iron Age samples, you can see elevated Anatolian farmer ancestry, and this was present in this population during the Iron Age, which is very interesting. And as you can see here with these samples from the latest study, the two samples from the medieval period closely resemble these samples, and I reckon this is because they're from the western fringes of the Iranian Plateau, and this suggests that there was this sort of profile which existed in Iran even during the Iron Age and cannot be attributed to the Arabs or even the Mesopotamians. Thus, the study does indeed refute the white nationalist Nemitz. Despite this, there are some reasonable white nationalists such as Stonelight who acknowledge that these samples cluster closely to contemporary Iranians, as evident from this post. Nemitz also posted burial of a woman born of incest in 2nd or 1st century BC Parthian Gilan. Zoroastrians universalized exposure for corpse disposal only centuries later, but practice of quadroda marriages to first-degree relatives must have been widespread, as this burial is otherwise ordinary. And this is a ridiculous claim to make, considering, as I previously discussed, the study mentioned that only 3 of the samples were descended from relatives or parents who were either first or second degree relatives, and this refutes Nemitz's claim. Thus, it's once again proven that white nationalists should not be trusted where it comes to ancient genomic studies. Moving on, the study acknowledges that some of the Levantine ancestry in these ancient samples can be masked by a combination of the Ganj Dara and Anatolia Neolithic farmers' ancestries, and this is what was later discussed in the supplementary information, though nonetheless the admixture chart was not clear as it was too small to be zoomed into, so I did not include it in this analysis. Moving on, in the study it was found that the Gol Afshan samples are closest to Neolithic samples and are a bit distinct from Chalcolithic samples. Nonetheless, they still fall under the ancient Iranian cline, and this is very interesting. Also, it seems to be the case that the 8 to 10% additional Andamanese hunter-gatherer ancestry found in the Gol Afshan sample sets is actually ancient and predates any sort of migration from a Shakri-Sokta South Asian related source, as one of the sites in Shakri-Sokta contains South Asian samples, but this analysis refutes that and it considers this ancestry to be present in ancient Iran even before any such migration took place. Another interesting finding of the study is that on a genetic level, there was a great degree of relatedness between the Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and Bronze Age Iranian populations that have been thus far sampled. And these ancient indigenous Iranian populations were also closely related to the ancient populations of Central Asia, particularly those of Turkmenistan. The relatedness is especially apparent between ancient samples from Turkmenistan from the sites of Geoksir and Goner, as well as the Sapli Tepe and Bustan sites from Uzbekistan, all of which exhibit strong genetic similarities with the Chalcolithic Tepe Hisar, Bronze Age Shah Tepe, and Bronze Age Shakri Sokta Group 1 cluster, which is quite interesting. Thus, it seems to be indeed the case that the ancient Iranian farmers were widespread across the Iranian Plateau as well as Central Asia. Now, the study has another interesting finding, which was that there was admixture between Caucasian hunter-gatherers and early Neolithic Iranians living in the plateau, and by the time of the Iron Age, these ancestries continued and made up around 45 to 51% of ancestry of the northwestern Iron Age Iranian groups, particularly those from the sites of Haji Firuz, Hassanlu, and Dinka Tepe. It's also worth mentioning that the Liarsanbon samples required an additional 16 to 26% ancestry from either an Anatolian farmer, a Neolithic Armenian, or a Chalcolithic Israel source, and this is interesting. And the authors also conclude that this is likely due to the fact that Liarsanbon is closer to the Western Iranian Plateau, which is interesting. Thus, the Caucasian hunter-gatherers and Neolithic Iranian farmers played a major role in the ethnogenesis of the ancient Iranians from the Achaemenid period and up until the Sassanian period. In terms of Bronze and Iron Age admixture for the three new sample sets that were featured in this study, you can see that the study concluded that the samples are primarily descended from a South Central Asian source and an indigenous Iranian source, particularly from the Iron Age, and this source here is Haji Firuz, which is very similar to Dinka Tepe and Tepe Hassanlu as well. And together, the three Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanian sample sets can be modeled as 52% Bronze Age Shah Tepe and 48% Haji Firuz Iron Age. Thus, it seems to be the case that these Iranians do indeed descend from the northwestern Iranian Iron Age population that has previously been sequenced and sampled. The medieval Iranians had a reduction of Neolithic Iranian ancestry, which is very interesting, though nonetheless they can still be modeled as around 80% deriving from the Hassanlu population from the Iron Age and around 20% from Shah Tepe. In terms of modern Iranians, they align with the majority of the Iranian prehistoric and historic samples, but what's interesting is that they do not exhibit the Indus periphery Klein characteristics that were previously described in the Bronze Age by Narasimhan. What's more is that contemporary Iranian Mazandaranis and Persians closely align with one another on the PCA, though their ancestral proportions, once utilizing QP-ADM, are a bit distinct. Nonetheless, they fall in the Iranian cluster. And I also wanted to note that the Fars dataset here is made up of different Iranians across Iran and not just solely of the Iranians from Fars. Thus, these results prove that the Iranians of today have maintained significant genetic continuity. Here are the conclusions for this study, and it was found that the Neolithic Iranians exhibited a great degree of relationship to the Caucasian hunter-gatherers, and this sort of ancestry continued to persist throughout Iranian history. What's more is that a previously undescribed component was found amongst the Neolithic Iranians, and this is the Andamanese hunter-gatherer component. Two other interesting conclusions drawn from this paper is that the Iran Neolithic and Caucasian hunter-gatherer ancestries were very prevalent and made up the majority of the genome of these Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanian era Iranians, and also that the steppe ancestry was very minimal in their genome. It was also found that the three sample sets were genetically very close to the indigenous farmers of the BMAC culture. The authors also acknowledge that more samples are needed from Iron Age Central Asia as well as Iron Age northeastern Iran to get a better picture of the genetic ethnogenesis that took place in the Iranian plateau following the Aryan migrations. One of the final points made by the study is that despite there being only two medieval genomes available, nonetheless there is a great degree of genetic continuity and the majority of the ancient Iranian gene pool has remained stable over the centuries with minor changes observed in the contemporary Iranian population, and this is in spite the fact that the Iranian plateau has been exposed to external interactions with Mesopotamia, the Levant, the Caucasus, and Anatolia. And the final point here is that this highlights the genetic stability of the region's inhabitants, even in the face of historical migrations and cultural shifts. It was also found that the paternal or Y chromosome and maternal or mitochondrial haplogroups that have evolved around the Persian plateau and are rare in ancient genome databases are present in both the available ancient and modern samples from Iran, which suggests the long-term continuity in the uniparental ancestries in the region, and this is also very interesting. Thus, it seems to be the case that the Iranians of today have maintained and preserved both their paternal and maternal lineages as well as their autosomal ancestry. Before I conclude, I just like to say that the study as well as my analysis refute the claims Jason Reza Jorjani made in his 2016 article titled Against Perennial Philosophy. The article was published by altright.com, which was the website of a far-right or white nationalist organization that is no longer active. And here is Jorjani's most fallacious claim, which has now been refuted by this study. He wrote, before the Arab, Turkic, and Mongol conquests of Iran, in other words, up to the end of the Sassanian period, the majority of Iranians were genetically identical to Europeans. And then he also fantasized about the supposed southward mass migrations of Scythians and Sarmatians, who he believed to have looked and thought like Germans. And even these claims about the Scythians and Sarmatians are ludicrous, as I previously proven that both of these groups were heavily admixed depending on the region where they invaded and settled. Thus, with the release of this study, I hope that Jason can finally let go of this fallacious claim and no longer promote it amongst his followers, as it is very ridiculous and ludicrous and is not grounded in any reality. I am of course referring to his claim that prior to the Arab, Turkic, and Mongol conquests of Iran, the majority of Iranians were genetically identical to Europeans. To conclude, in this analysis I took a look at a recent study that was released on the genetic origins of the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanians, particularly from sites associated with those three empires in northern Iran. What was found is that the individuals from the three sites were primarily of Neolithic Iranian descent and had only minimal steppe ancestry, thus proving a largely indigenous origin for the ancient population of northern Iran. And the sites in question are Liarsanbon, Marsin Chal, and Vestemin, and these are known to be associated with the ancient Iranian empires, particularly the people that lived there during that time. From the ancient samples, it was also proven that contemporary Iranians have continuity not only autosomally but also in terms of their paternal and maternal lineages. Thus, contemporary Iranians are indeed the direct descendants of the ancient Iranians, particularly those from the Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sassanian periods in Iran's history. That is it for this analysis. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.